Bore da pawb and welcome to the Wales Fiscal Analysis election briefing event. I'm Dr. Rachel Minto from the Wales Government Centre, and it is my absolute pleasure to be hosting the Wales Fiscal Analysis event today, where our expert panel will be taking us through their analyses of the party manifestos and exploring the fiscal outlook for the next Senedd term. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, Wales Fiscal Analysis is a research team that undertakes authoritative and independent research into the public finances, taxation and public spending of Wales. Wales Fiscal Analysis is hosted by the Wales Government Centre and the School of Law and Politics at Cardiff University, and funded through a partnership between Cardiff University, the Welsh Government, the Welsh Local Government Association and Solace Wales. And the programme has continued the work of Wales Public Services 2025, which was hosted by Cardiff Business School up to August 2018. Now we have a three-strong panel today, and it's my pleasure to introduce all three. Firstly, let me introduce Gito Ifan, who is a research associate at the Wales Government Centre. He joined the Centre in 2015 to work on the Government Expenditure and Revenue Wales project and is now part of the Wales Fiscal Analysis team. Then we have Kian Sean, who is a research assistant at the Wales Government Centre. He joined the Wales Fiscal Analysis team in 2018. He has led work on local government finances and social care alongside all areas of the Wales Fiscal Analysis project. And then finally, let me introduce David Phillips, who is an associate director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. His two main areas of research are devolved and local government finance, as well as tax and social protection policy in developing countries. He's written extensively on the fiscal frameworks of Wales and Scotland, as well as conducting recent research on property tax reform in Wales. So we are in good hands this morning. In terms of how the event will run, we're going to start with presentations from each of the panelists, and then we'll have time for questions. So without further ado, let me hand over to Kian, who will be providing an overall outlook for the Welsh budget over the next Senedd term and exploring the challenges facing the next Welsh Government.
Thanks. So thank you for the introduction and bore da chi gyd. So in the first presentation today, I'm going to be outlining the projected outlook for the Welsh budget over the next Senedd term, and also what that tells us about the pretty unprecedented fiscal context in which the upcoming election will take place. And to do that, I think it's firstly worth reminding ourselves of where the Welsh budget was at before the pandemic, and also what impact the very large allocations that have been made over the past year have had on Welsh Government spending. So here you can see the path of the Welsh Government's budget for day-to-day resource spending over the past decade. One thing really stands out there in green. I don't think we can underestimate just how much of an impact the additional COVID funding has had on the size of the Welsh budget. In fact, last year, the Welsh budget grew by an extraordinary 25% in real terms. Of course, that level of spending won't be sustained going forwards. But the second thing to point out is that if we ignore the portion of the budget financed by COVID, you can see that core funding has now recovered its 2010-11 levels in real terms. But of course, the population has grown since then, and if we adjust to account for that, then on a per capita basis, core Welsh Government spending remains around 4% below where it was at the beginning of the last decade in real terms. And actually that masks quite a big difference in the way various spending areas have been hit. So although the NHS, for instance, has seen real terms growth in its funding over recent years, if you consider the portion of spending outside the NHS, which would include spending on local government, for instance, that portion of spending is still projected to be 12% below pre-austerity levels this year. So in many ways, the Welsh budget remains scarred by the effects of those austerity policies. So where has this large injection of COVID funding come from? Well, in total, last year, the Welsh Government had £5.7 billion of COVID funding to allocate. Most of that was delivered through what was called a funding guarantee. So you may recall that early on in the pandemic, COVID funding was being delivered through Barnett consequentials. So effectively UK government spending in England in areas devolved to Wales triggered a population share consequential. But there were some problems with that approach. First of all, the frequency of the spending announcements, but also the size of the consequentials, and the fact that there was often a time lag between when a policy was announced for England and when the subsequent consequential was confirmed. All of those things made it quite difficult for the devolved governments to plan their pandemic response with certainty. And so instead, what happened was from July, the UK government announced a funding guarantee for the devolved governments, which effectively acted as a sort of a minimum guaranteed increase to the block grant. Now, that was initially set at £4 billion for Wales, but it was later topped up to £5.7 billion. You can see that in yellow, around £500 million has been carried forward into the next financial year, or into this financial year. Now, in normal times, the fiscal framework rules wouldn't allow that, but the Treasury granted special dispensation this year because the funding guarantee was topped up quite late in the financial year. On top of that, we've had further consequentials triggered by spending decisions at the spending review in autumn, the March 2021 budget, and subsequent announcements on health and rates relief in England. And that brings the total amount of COVID funding available for the Welsh Government in this financial year to £2.5 billion, which is around half of what was spent last year. Now, a portion of that total has already been committed, and we estimate that around £1 billion remains uncommitted for the incoming Welsh Government. But of course, barring an early election, the next Welsh Government will be serving a 5-year term. So what do we know about the fiscal outlook beyond this year? Well, based on the indicative spending plans laid out by the Chancellor in March, we can make a few assumptions to project the size of the Welsh budget over the next 5 years. There are multi-year spending plans in place for schools and health in England, so we roughly know the amount of consequentials that will be triggered by those. But once those spending plans lapse, we assume that health and education spending, along with international aid and defence spending at a UK level, will grow in line with GDP, and that spending on all other departments grow in line with the total change in other UK departmental spending. And you can see that in cash terms, core funding is set to increase to £19.3 billion by 2025-26. And that's not a particularly conservative outlook. By the end of the forecast period, core funding would be 6.5% above pre-austerity levels in real terms. And on a per person basis, by 2025-26, funding will have recovered pre-austerity levels, though for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that will not be true for some areas of the Welsh budget. And to put that in perspective, we can compare it to the path of day-to-day spending of the 4th and 5th Assemblies. Here, I think you can get a real sense of how the 4th Assembly was set against a pretty tough fiscal outlook, particularly when you consider that the Welsh Government didn't have powers to adjust the size of their budgets through devolved tax policy at the time. There is a bit of a blip in the data in 2020-21. That's largely artificial because of the effects of the GDP deflator. So it probably makes more sense if you can imagine a straight line between 2019 and 2011. And if you do that, then the average growth in funding over the last Assembly, the 5th Assembly, is actually fairly similar to what we're projected to see over the next Parliament. So about 1.6% a year in real terms. Now, the last Assembly really was a tale of two halves in a way. And you can see from the chart, the sort of the step change in UK government, their approach to spending, particularly around 2018 onwards, when they started making quite large multi-year commitments to the NHS in England. And actually last year, we estimate that the core block grants, excluding that COVID funding, was around £1.4 billion larger than what had initially been projected before the last Senedd election, which perhaps goes to show the tendency of the UK government to revise their spending plans. And that might be something to bear in mind for later in this presentation. So that's the headline trajectory of the Welsh budget. But what about the levels of spending on different budget areas? Well, we can make a few assumptions to provide an illustrative look at what this might mean for the NHS, local government, and other parts of the Welsh budget. So we assume that the Welsh Government uses projected consequentials from NHS and school spending in England to fund the equivalent services in Wales. And we also assume that everything else grows in line with the rest of the budget. Now, again, I should point out that this is only illustrative because consequentials are not hypothecated, and the next Welsh Government could decide to allocate the funding in a different way. But if those assumptions do hold, it means that the NHS, local government, and pretty much all areas of the Welsh budget would see real terms growth over the next 4 years. NHS spending would grow by around 2.5% a year in real terms over 4 years. You can also see the effects of the multi-year spending plans for schools in England on that chart, which result in faster growth in school consequentials for Wales. Now, in practice, because most local government funding is not hypothecated, local authorities may decide to allocate some of that school resources to help meet demand in other areas, like social services, for example. And in fact, that seems quite likely because unlike social services, demand for schools is projected to fall in Wales over the next few years. And because the Barnett consequentials are based on Wales's population share and not the pupil population share, Wales actually does stand to benefit from those demographic trends. For other parts of the Welsh budget, though, you can see that there'll be limited real terms growth over the next Senedd terms. And particularly next year, the outlook appears to be more challenging, with the possibility for some real terms cuts. You might recall from an earlier chart that no COVID funding has been allocated by the UK government beyond this financial year. So the combination of that sharp drop-off in funding, as well as slower growth in the core block grants, means that the outlook for next year in particular is more austere. So we know that overall, Welsh Government spending will grow in real terms over the next 5 years. What we haven't yet considered are the spending pressures that governments face every year. So these can be related to inflation, wage inflation. They could be associated with growing demand for services. And of course, the next Welsh Government will also need to face the cost of dealing with the aftermath of COVID. Now, earlier this month, we published 2 in-depth reports evaluating the spending pressures in the NHS and local government over the next Senedd term. And now, as it happens, the health-related consequentials look like they are sufficient to fund underlying pressures in the NHS over the next 4 years. But we know that the pandemic is likely to have a big financial implication for the NHS on top of this. In particular, we know that social distancing and enhanced infection control, that's likely to impact productivity for some years. There's a potential for a further direct costs associated with TTP and a potential revaccination programme. And the next Welsh Government will also need to grapple with the task of dealing with the backlog for elective care surgery. And because we've seen a sharp drop in referrals over the past year, there is also a possibility that there might be some pent-up demand in the system, which may resurface as the lockdown measures are lifted. And in fact, if you add all of those on top of the underlying pressures, you can see that there is a significant funding gap between the projected health consequentials and total funding pressures of around £740 million next year, averaging 360 million over the rest of the Senedd term. Now, that could pose a significant challenge for the next Welsh Government, because if additional funding to deal with those pressures is not forthcoming, then they may be under pressure to allocate additional resources to the NHS on top of those health consequentials. But of course, that would leave some departments facing real terms cuts. It would involve trade-offs. We also evaluated local government pressures over the next 4 years. You can see from the yellow bars that these are largely driven by growing demand for social services. In fact, if the pressures are met in full, by the end of 2026, local authorities will be spending as much on social services as they do on education in Wales. On current plans, local authorities face a funding gap of around £180 million next year. But if the Welsh Government met the cost of NHS pressures from its own budget, as I described earlier, and also without any additional funding to deal with those cost pressures, then the outlook for local governments could be considerably worse. In this scenario, they might be facing a potential funding gap of around £600 million next year, and then average shortfalls of around 360 million in future years. And that's also assuming a 4.5% increase in council tax bills as well. So it looks like on current plans, the projected increase to the Welsh budget will be insufficient to meet spending pressures over the next Senedd term, which suggests that trade-offs are going to remain a feature of Welsh fiscal policy for some time yet. But of course, we do know that UK government spending plans can, and they do often change. So far we've taken the indicative plan set out by the Chancellor back in March as a given. But we expect a multi-year spending review to occur in the autumn, and that should give us more clarity on the path of UK spending and by extension, the Welsh Block grants over the coming years. There are some indications that the Chancellor might not be willing to make very large upward revisions to the current spending plans. You might recall that he reaffirmed his commitment not to increase income tax rates, VAT or national insurance contributions over the next parliamentary term, over the current parliamentary term even. And given that those taxes together account for 60% of UK government revenues, it will be significantly difficult actually to raise large sums of additional revenue through other taxes. But perhaps a bigger obstacle is his commitment to balance the current budget by 2025-26, which in the absence of any revisions to the economic forecasts, that effectively limits the use of borrowing to fund large increases in day-to-day spending. Now, whether you think you will renege on one of those promises will probably influence your optimism about the outlook for the Welsh budget. I think it's certainly fair to say that the current plans certainly don't look deliverable without imposing some considerable hardship over the coming years. So given all that, let's consider an alternative scenario. So since the beginning of the pandemic, the UK government has made some downward revisions to its spending plans from next year onwards. If they reverted to their more generous pre-pandemic plans, that could release an additional £600 million for the Welsh budget next year compared to our baseline scenario. And in that case, the NHS, local government pressures, they could be broadly met over the next Senedd term, although there'd still be a small funding gap next year, however. Again, if we assume that the consequentials are passed on, the NHS budget grows by almost 3.75% a year in real terms. Local government spending would grow by around 2% a year, with all areas of the Welsh budget growing by at least 1% a year in real terms. Although even in that scenario, there's a small real terms cut to some areas of the budget next year, although the growth in spending does pick up in future years. So that could be one way of increasing the likelihood of meeting spending pressures. But of course, it does rely on the UK government changing its spending plans. Now, if that doesn't happen, or if spending is revised upwards by a smaller amount, it may be worth considering using the devolved tax powers. So the Welsh Government could get the budget up to a similar level by increasing each rate of Welsh income tax by 2p. Now, that wouldn't be sufficient to meet the spending pressures in full next year, but at least over the medium term, it could provide a way of meeting them and funding enhanced public services. Now on this chart, you can see the mechanical impact of that tax rise. You may need to increase the rates by a slightly larger amount to offset any potential behavioural or migration effect. And of course, you know, the economic and behavioural effects of tax rate changes are always going to be highly uncertain. But there are also risks to ruling out income tax rises over the next Senedd term, particularly if the UK government only makes limited revisions to its current spending plans. And we also know that above inflation council tax rises are almost certain to continue if local authorities are to meet spending pressures. And so the next Welsh Government may also want to consider whether its income tax powers could be put to use as a more progressive alternative to those. But to summarise, although the block grant is set to grow in real terms over the next Senedd term, on current plans, spending pressures are still likely to go unmet. Now, reverting to the more generous pre-pandemic plans could allow the next Welsh Government to broadly meet those spending pressures, but that involves relying on the UK Government to change course. And that means effectively that there is fairly limited scope to fund large manifesto commitments without A, either increasing revenues, or B, relying on a change to UK spending plans, which perhaps raises the question about whether the next Welsh Government should make use of its powers over devolved taxes, either perhaps to fund additional spending if consequentials aren't forthcoming, or indeed to limit the more regressive increases to council tax. And I'm sure that both Gitzel and David will have plenty more to say about that. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Gitzel to talk about the party manifestos. Diolch.
Yeah, diolch yn fawr, Cian. I'll be presenting firstly on some of the main areas of spending over in the manifestos, and trying to highlight the main spending and tax commitments being made by each of the three main parties. Across the board, there's a significant lack of costings contained in the manifestos. Most manifesto promises also sort of lack the sufficient detail required to make a judgment as to their costs. Where we can, though, we try and gauge the size of specific manifesto promises ourselves. There will be a longer version of this presentation on our website, which will go through some other commitments that I won't be going through on higher education, childcare, early years, which we'll put online after the event. Secondly, I'll be assessing the overall fiscal plans implied by the manifestos in the context of the outlook discussed by Cian. It's very difficult to really assess whether manifesto programmes are affordable and fully costed in the round, as they claim. There have been no comprehensive costings document published showing assumptions laying behind policy proposals. Of course, the parties are facing significant uncertainty as to the eventual size of the block grant and the spending pressures they'll eventually face if in government. However, the lack of costings, as I said, is a concern. So if you firstly turn to NHS spending, which is essentially half of the budget for day-to-day spending, the Conservatives say that they would enshrine their NHS covenant into law, guaranteeing increased spending every year. They've said that they'd like to see at least 2% increases to the NHS budget each year. We think that means by 2025-26, that results in about £1.4 billion of a year of extra day-to-day spending in cash terms. And that would be slightly below the consequentials that we're projecting from NHS spending in England, though there's some uncertainty on that after 2023-24. In that, they promise 3,000 more nurses and 1,200 more doctors by 2026. The growth in the number of doctors is slightly above recent trends, and significant increase in nurses would compared to sort of pre-COVID trends. If you move on to the Labour Party's manifesto and promises on the NHS, they promise an NHS recovery plan launched on day one. In subsequent media stories, it was suggested that would amount to £1 billion, though it's unclear over how many years. As Cian said, there is substantial COVID-19 funding unallocated in this year's budget, but that COVID-19 funding comes to an end after this year, and NHS recovery is going to take many years, perhaps all the years of the next Senedd term. There's no overall medium-term spending plan commitments in the Labour manifesto. We think the increase in training funding outlined of 8% is sort of already in the baseline, and the commitment to train 12,000 doctors, nurses and health professionals would broadly be already sort of in the pipeline. And like the other parties, they are promising a North Wales medical school, which would have a cost implication unless funding was taken away from existing medical schools. If you look at the Plaid Cymru's manifesto, there's no overall target or commitment for NHS funding growth over the next Parliament or the next Senedd term. They do promise an additional 1,000 doctors and 5,000 degree level health professionals, such as nurses, midwives, and physios. Overall, especially the increase of 4,000 nurses implies a significantly faster growth in staffing numbers than pre-COVID trends, given other NHS staff numbers will have to increase over coming years as well. If we move on to, or if I summarise NHS spending in the manifestos, that all parties are focused on NHS recovery, but of course they vary in detail and the scope. They're all promising increasing NHS staffing resources, but with fewer details on projected costs and pay implications. The NHS spending will likely need to be significantly higher after the pandemic, as Kian highlighted, and all parties, especially maybe next year, the next financial year, all parties will be relying on health-related consequentials from UK government or unspecified cuts to other areas. If we turn now to schools funding, another large area of the Welsh budget, the Conservative Manifesto argues that there is a £1,000 per pupil underfunding in Wales compared to what the funding given by the UK government. I'm not sure where that figure comes from, but they claim that underfunding will end. Given that UK government funding will also increase in England over coming years, that's a significant commitment, but they don't provide an overall figure as to what they're planning on spending. They do promise, however, 5,000 more teachers, which again is a significant commitment. We think that given projected pay deals, that could cost about £230 million a year if achieved by 2025-26. Just meeting the cost and funding pressures in the existing teacher workforce, we think could cost significant amounts. And if you add in non-staff and other staff costs over the next few years, it could imply overall increases in school spending of around £500 million a year. That's our estimate of what the manifesto implies. That's significantly above the consequentials we project from UK government spending plans in England. The projected costs for the Welsh Government could be lower if it was part funded by council tax increases or by slower growth in teacher pay over the next few years, although I'm not sure how that's compatible with drawing in a lot of people into the teacher profession. If there's also some other education commitments, for example, funding for children in receipt of free school meals to cover school holidays for the remainder of the Senedd term, that currently being partly funded by temporary COVID-19 funding. So after this year, that'll have to come out from day-to-day budget. Plaid Cymru's accompanying letter and costing suggests £600 million additional for school spending over the course of the Senedd term, reportedly planning £300 million a year of additional spending by 2025-26. They want to an additional 4,500 teachers and support staff. It's difficult to cost that directly because it's not only teachers, and we don't really know what the mix between staff and teachers and other staff would be. But given the cost pressures I discussed earlier, it looks fairly ambitious within that given envelope of spending. Another big commitment by Plaid Cymru is on free school meals provision, initially to cover all universal credit households and eventually extending to all primary school children. Given that there will be already an increase in free school meals eligibility, we think the initial cost could be something in the low tens of millions, and they've reportedly budgeted £160 million for universal free school meals in primary schools, which we thought is probably a fair estimate of the cost. In terms of the Labour's promises on school, they promise a school catch-up plan, but the scale of this plan is not specified, however, beyond what we know that they've committed already. They promise an additional 1,800 tutoring staff in schools for as long as they are needed. It's quite modest in terms of tutors per pupil, and again, with no real costs provided in the manifesto. And like other parties, there is no specific target for an increase in the number of teachers over the next Senedd term. And on free school meals, there's a commitment to expand entitlement, but only as far as resources allow, which is obviously quite a vague promise, given the budget will be increasing over the next few years. So in summary then, on schools funding, there's little detail on the scope and costs of any front-loaded catch-up plans, though per pupil spending would increase and is likely to increase over the next term after falling over the last decade. Especially considering the projected decreasing pupil numbers. Luke Sibietta's work suggests that manifesto commitments could be more ambitious in providing multi-year packages to deal with the legacy effects of the pandemic. Again, probably the parties are relying on the UK government, especially next year, increasing spending in England in the short term. On social care, all parties are proposing increasing wages paid to social care staff. The Conservatives and Plaid Cymru want a £10 per hour minimum wage for social care workers, and the Labour want to implement the real living wage in the sector of £9.50 currently. That would entail an initial cost of around £19 million a year based on an estimate by LE Wales last year, growing slightly over the course of the next few years. The Conservatives, meanwhile, want to increase the capital limit to 100,000 for those accessing residential care from its current level of 50,000. This is difficult to estimate, but based on previous increases, we think the cost could be roughly £40 million a year. Both Plaid Cymru and Labour are in favour of social care, free for all at the point of need. LE Wales estimated last year that the cost of providing free personal care was around 131 million to 192 million this year, on top of underlying pressures that would need to be funded over the next few years. Labour want to pursue a UK sustainable solution, a cross-UK solution. However, they also acknowledge or claim that the current UK government show no sign of changing that, and they may then consult on potential Wales-only changes to meet long-term care needs. Meanwhile, Plaid Cymru want to create a national health service and care service. They think that this is achievable in the current Senedd term. They've set aside reportedly £250 million by 2025 to fund that. This is broadly in line with the LE Wales costs. The Conservative manifesto makes, if you move on to tax policy commitments, the Conservative manifesto contains significant tax-related policy commitments. So firstly, we have essentially two tax cuts in reserved areas, VAT and national insurance, which we will presumably have some administrative costs attached and require cooperation from HMRC. Extending the VAT cut for tourism this year, we think would cost about £60 million based on UK costs. So, reasonable and manageable given the unallocated funding in the budget this year. The Jumpstart scheme is more difficult to cost. It could be significant if even a small share of the 400,000 or so people employed by micro businesses in Wales become eligible for the scheme. They also promise a freeze on council tax for 2 years. If we understand correctly, they provide freeze funding of 80 million to 90 million in the first year. That would be equivalent to quite a substantial council tax increase next year, and then fund the equivalent of 2% increases for the following year. That implies an additional £33 million in 2023-24. That suggests that over those 2 years, funding would broadly match the opportunity cost of the freeze for councils. They'd also cut land transaction tax, and David will cover that more on that later, but we think that could cost upwards of £39 million given the distribution of transactions currently and a strong forecast growth in residential transactions forecast at the moment. They also commit to abolishing business rates for small businesses. We think that would cost about £100 million to £105 million a year. And there's no indication of the scale or the cost of business rates free zones that they've also proposed. And there's also the potential costs to tax revenues for the two proposed free ports promised by the manifesto. The Conservatives also promise an income tax cut, and it would be a cut to the basic rate if they meet their jobs target by 2025. However, that's unlikely to be funded by more people paying into the pot, as was claimed recently. This is because the way that the fiscal framework works, the block grant adjustments made to reflect tax devolution, and those grow in line with comparable UK government revenues. So what matters for the Welsh budget is the relative growth in the Welsh tax base and not the overall growth. So the additional jobs only create a surplus for the Welsh budget if not matched by growth in the tax base of England and Northern Ireland. And I'm presuming the Conservatives don't believe the UK government won't grow the English tax base at all over the next 5 years. So that means that cutting income tax will involve a trade-off between trying to find savings or cuts to day-to-day spending when that cut comes into force, if that cut comes into force. So Labour's manifesto, on the other hand, promised no increase in Welsh rates of income tax as long as the economic impact of coronavirus lasts. They want to see a strong recovery in personal finances across households first. I think there's two problems with that reasoning. I'd argue that this is a barrier to using income tax powers as opposed to in normal times. I think firstly, because council tax will be increasing, and that will likely hit the households most affected by the pandemic. And secondly, in terms of the economic effect of an income tax increase, it would be a balanced budget increase. The drop in disposable income would be matched by an increase in government spending, and the immediate net effect will depend on which is a larger economic effect. Of course, there's some other things to consider on the supply side as well. On council tax, they make a commitment, a vague commitment to reform council tax, which David will discuss. And they also plan to consult on legislation permitting local authorities to raise a tourism levy. Plaid Cymru, I'll leave discussion of Plaid Cymru's property tax reforms to David, but just to note that there are some new tax ideas and look quite difficult in reality to implement in the current devolved settlement, but they also obviously want to change that. So now I want to turn to looking at what these manifesto plans mean in their entirety against the likely outlook for the Welsh budget. So overall, we can say that the Labour Party have taken a very different approach from the other two main parties, and a very different approach from the governing party in Scotland, the SNP, and their counterparts in Scottish Labour. Going through the manifesto commitments, we can only really identify additional spending commitments, either with costs in the manifesto or roughly costed by us, amounting to approximately £100 million per year, mainly because they don't have firm commitments on NHS and schools spending. So to put that in perspective, on the right here, you see the cash terms increase in the Welsh resource budget from 2021 to 2025 in our baseline scenario. And specific spending commitments make up only a very small share of that increase. And that's, if we assume NHS spending increases in line with NHS consequentials, that would entail £1.4 billion by 2025-26. And just to underline, that's our assumption, that's not specified in the manifesto. Then it gives you an idea of the headroom that these plans have against even a pretty pessimistic baseline increase in the Welsh budget. In that orange box, you need to find funding for other spending manifesto commitments, as well as non-specified funding pressures in the budget that Kian discussed. So I guess it will be fair to say that the Labour manifesto is more cautious and small c conservative, maybe against the prospects for the Welsh budget. The positives, perhaps, of this approach is that it maintains flexibilities. I think it broadly suggests a path close to the baseline scenario in the previous presentation and broadly continues patterns over recent years. The downsides, I think, is I suppose it provides little information on the overall fiscal plans, what the main spending priorities would be, what the potential trade-offs perhaps over the medium term could be. And this approach, I think, would have made sense in the past two elections where real term cuts were being projected for the Welsh budget. But this time around, the budget will be increasing, the budget, albeit in the face of significant spending pressures. And secondly, the Welsh Government does now have the power to vary the size, vary the size of the Welsh budget at the margins through devolved tax powers. So making additional spending commitments to priority areas doesn't entail being totally reliant on the UK government moving first. The Conservative manifesto, in contrast, implies large increases to NHS and school spending alongside other specific spending commitments, such as on just social care and childcare. What sets it apart from the other manifestos, I think, is the proposed tax cuts. So again, to put this in perspective, if you compare the manifesto spending commitments that we can identify against our baseline scenario, So not included there are other manifesto commitments we haven't been able to cost, for example, higher education spending and so on, and other pressures on spending. I think in general that implies that this might underestimate maybe the NHS spending we're likely to see, and maybe overestimate the school spending that we're likely to see. But if we take on top of that into account cuts to business rates, land transaction tax, council tax for the freezing council tax for 2 years, and a 1p basic rate of income tax cut, then these manifesto commitments already overshoot our projected increase in the size of the Welsh budget. That is, of course, our estimate of what these commitments imply. Of course, it is likely that the UK government changes course given spending pressures in England. Returning to pre-pandemic scenario would provide more headroom against the manifesto commitments we haven't included here and other spending pressures. So we can say that that in our rather pessimistic baseline scenario, there would be very little room, if any, for other manifesto commitments and spending pressures. If the UK government doesn't change course on its current spending plans, then cuts from other areas of the budget or some reversal of these proposed tax cuts will be needed. But it does suggest perhaps some clear blue water between the Welsh Conservatives' manifesto and the Conservatives' Chancellor's current fiscal plans. Ironically, perhaps increasing spending substantially at a UK level in current forecasts would entail higher levels of taxation and more borrowing, assuming that the Conservatives still believe that borrowing for day-to-day spending in normal times is not desirable. That implies that the lower tax on a Welsh level would need to go hand in hand with higher tax on a UK level. So lastly then, and definitely not least in terms of volume, the Plaid Cymru manifesto, it's worth going through some of the other large spending commitments that made in the manifesto that I haven't covered yet. Chiefly among them is the weekly £35 child payment to help 180,000 children living in poverty. That's set initially at £10 per week, growing to £35 per week by the end of the first term. Based on a crude estimate, based on given what they think the number of children living in poverty, we don't really know, eligibility and take-up rates and the future path in children in poverty, but that crude estimate would imply costs of around £300 million a year for that full £35 per week payment. For comparison, the Scottish child payment is set to increase to £180 million by 2025-26, though the parties are proposing a significant increase to that at this election there. Of course, this power is contingent on the devolution of welfare powers, and Plaid Cymru say that they'd find other ways of tackling child poverty if those welfare powers aren't devolved. So the second large spending commitment in terms of day-to-day spending that I think we should mention is the cost of servicing Welsh Government borrowing. That's said to be around £120 million a year from the resource budget. That would be, I think, pretty consistent with a very fast growth in the borrowing that they want to make. I think that this sort of borrowing is probably achievable in terms of cost. However, delivering this sort of increased investment quickly will be very challenging. And I think it's unlikely that this will be allowed, that sort of increase in borrowing powers will be allowed. The alternative options provided may require more time and may be more expensive, and that pushes payments back into the next Senedd term, perhaps, or the Senedd term after the next Senedd term. The manifesto has been subject to an independent assessment, and unlike the other parties, that the accompanying document usefully allows us to see their assumptions on funding this programme. First, if we look at our baseline scenario for the Welsh resource budget, this again shows our projections on current UK government plans in cash terms. Plaid Cymru are assuming a 2% increase, real terms increase in the block grant funding. This is what we think that implies. So it's higher than our baseline scenario. But then again, it's still below what we termed the pre-pandemic plans scenario described in the previous presentation. So I think we'd agree with the independent assessment that that's optimistic, but not unreasonable. The other source of funding for new spending commitments is apparently the efficiency review. And this was not specified in detail, but was expected to yield budgetary savings of 1% per annum. I think that's probably maybe the weakness of these spending plans, which I'll return to in a bit. But if we just to give a sense of the scale of these spending commitments, we're going to again look at the baseline scenario for the cash increase in the resource budget and the increase assumed by Plaid Cymru. Again, this is our assumption on NHS funding because there's no firm NHS funding commitments made. This is our own projection, sort of passing on the consequentials from health spending in England. Again, we think that's around £1.4 billion by 2025-26. Now, if you add in the other specific spending commitments that have either been provided or that we can roughly estimate ourselves, that broadly matches the assumed increase in the block grant. And what that leaves little room for further manifesto commitments that we couldn't cost or other underlying spending pressures, except for those funded by efficiency gains. So maybe to summarize Plaid Cymru's manifesto, unlike other manifestos, there are large commitments outside of the NHS and schools in what will be a relatively tight budget context that's primarily aimed at, we think, towards children in early years and increasing essentially or meeting the costs for families. I think it's an optimistic on the increase in UK government spending, but as I said earlier, it's realistic. One key concern would be the amount of commitments which would require substantial devolution on favourable terms and changes to fiscal framework. I think in all of these areas given here, I think the increase in borrowing powers is also going to be quite unlikely. So that's one maybe drawback on the manifesto. And then the full delivery of these manifesto spending commitments appears to be dependent on the efficiency review. The independent assessment calls challenging and not impossible. 1% efficiency increases in NHS spending, as I said earlier, that's half the budget. That's close to the long run average growth assumed in NHS budget plans. However, that's sort of already assumed as part of meeting underlying funding pressures. So it's difficult to see how that yields funding for new funding priorities, but it could fund NHS pressures. But setting aside the huge impact of COVID-19 as well on productivity across many areas of spending, I think it's very challenging in local government. That's especially for social care, given historic trends in productivity in the social care sector, and especially after a decade of being significantly below pre-austerity levels in real terms. The UK government, as I said earlier, may overshoot and may decide to spend above Plaid Cymru's assumed envelope, but it would appear that delivering these spending promises again would require very ambitious targets for efficiency gains, and that might mean unspecified cuts to other spending areas and eventual maybe tax increases. And of course, given that might be a legitimate objective if you think that other areas of the budget could be directed towards, for example, the child payment or free school meals, etc. So in summary, then, I think the impact of decisions on taxation made by parties or the proposals made by the proposals of parties on taxation and spending choices should be offered and should be available to the electorate, and that was one of the principles outlined by the Silk Commission when it proposed changes to the Welsh Government's fiscal powers with the aim of increasing accountability of the Welsh Government. It was hoped the Welsh political parties could offer Welsh voters the choice in elections between different levels of devolved spending and taxation to best meet the preferences of voters. I suppose given how long it's taken me to put this presentation together, it would suggest those offers to the Welsh electorate are not as clear as perhaps the Silk Commission would have hoped. There's a lack of detail on spending plans across the board. The Conservatives and Plaid Cymru have more specific spending and tax commitments than Labour, but with equally little in the way of freely available costing information and specific policies. As a few last points, there are some common themes and priorities, as would be expected: COVID-19 recovery, NHS spending and schools. I think all the parties will be relying on changes in UK government spending plans, especially in 2022-23, to meet some of the post-pandemic legacies and recovering fully in terms of public services. And to reiterate, whichever party or parties form the next Welsh Government will need to be flexible to changing circumstances. In general, I think the manifestos make little reference to the potential tough fiscal choices and trade-offs required over the next Senedd term. So that's all for me. I think I brushed through that, so hopefully it's enough detail there, but the slides will be available, the extended slides will be available on our website. So I'll now pass over to David Phillips, who will look at the property tax reform in this election and sort of the options for further reform across the next Senedd term. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr.
So bore da pawb, good morning everyone. So I'm David Phillips and I'm Associate Director at the IFS, and it's a pleasure to be with you virtually today, although it's been well over a year since I've been back in Wales, unfortunately. So in the next 15 minutes, I'll talk a bit about Wales's property taxes, some recent trends and reforms, the opportunity for much more radical reform, and an assessment of the party's manifesto plans. So first up, how much has raised in property taxes and how has that changed in recent years? Well, there's land transactions tax. That raised about £260 million in 2019, just before the COVID crisis. It's subsequently fallen because of the stalling of transactions early in the crisis and then the sort of reduction in rate with the LTT holiday. Residential is expected to rebound quite strongly and actually be above pre-crisis levels in the coming financial year. Commercial is expected to be depressed. And I think that's kind of quite an interesting thing looking ahead, you know, what it suggests about the sort of commercial property market. Much bigger is council tax. That's actually held up pretty well during the COVID crisis. I think there was concerns at the start that we see huge amounts of non-payment of council tax, you know, unemployment would skyrocket and that would push up the cost of council tax support. That hasn't really happened, in part because of the furlough scheme, probably. So council taxes continue to grow. Business rates, they did fall during the crisis. That was largely because of the holiday for the retail, hospitality and leisure sector, which in Wales is continuing into this year in full. I think the question looking ahead is to what extent will these taxes, you know, come under long-term pressure due to changes in the high street, changes in office occupancy, so on and so forth. Looking at the COVID-19 measures on property taxation, by far the biggest obviously is the 100% rates relief for the retail, hospitality and leisure sector. This year the relief has been uncapped for hospitality and leisure, but the exclusion for those with rateable values of above £500,000 still applies in the retail sector. And I think this means that, you know, the plans are more generous in England, where the relief goes down to 66% from the summer, except perhaps the largest retailers, given this cap that applies in Wales. And there's a big question about how rates will be reapplied to these sectors from 22-23 onwards. Is it reapplied in one go? Is it, you know, slowly phased back in? I think one issue to kind of bear in mind is that if this cut were to be extended or partially extended into the long term, I'd expect the main beneficiary to be the property owner rather than the actual occupier, the shop or the restaurant or the hotel occupying the property, because there's very strong evidence that property taxes like these just get reflected in property prices and rents in the long run. The other COVID measure obviously was the increase in the land taxation tax threshold. And that increase to £250,000 was less generous than the increase applied in England and Northern Ireland. There's some evidence that parts of the year that the rebound was somewhat less strong than in England and Northern Ireland. But also the OBR expects, only a especially small fall in transactions after the expiry of this policy. So I'm not sure that the expiry of this policy will have a particularly bad effect on the property market in Wales. So there've also been some longer term reforms, perhaps more significantly for land transactions tax. A series of reforms mean that compared to the previous or the still existing statutory land tax, residential land transaction tax in Wales is lower for low value main properties and higher for high value properties. And you can see that on this chart, which shows the tax rate as a percentage of value by the purchase price of a property. And you can see down at the bottom area there below around £250,000 that the tax is lower in Wales. But that at high levels of property prices, the tax rate is substantially higher. I should say most properties in Wales are in the kind of range where the tax is lower. Taxes are also higher for additional properties and for first-time buyers in Wales. There's an additional increase in the first on the additional property levy in Wales, and first-time buyers don't benefit in Wales from the lower rates that they do in England and Northern Ireland. I think it's debatable about whether these policies are kind of suited to kind of meet the aims and objectives they're there for in the first place. Probably keeping the tax simpler is not a bad idea. But I wanted to spend a bit more time talking about, I think, the case for more radical reform of property tax, and in particular, council tax. And underlying this call for, I think, more radical reform is the fact that house price growth has varied substantially across Wales since the last revaluation of council tax back in 2005 using 2003 values. So since then, property prices across Wales have roughly doubled, but they have changed substantially differently across different parts of Wales. Up just over 3/4 in Wrexham, up over 170% in Blaen a Gwent. Council tax, despite being, also not only being out of date given these changes in property values, also is and always has been regressive with respect to property value. And that's because the tax on, for example, a band I property is only 3.5 times band A, whereas it's worth at least 9.5 times. And the banding system means that two properties differing in value by just £1 can face taxes that are £100 different a year if they're just on either side of that band. Conversely, two properties differing in value by tens of thousands can face the same tax. And the single person discount in council tax also encourages inefficient use of housing, because in effect, the discount is bigger the bigger the property you live in, or the more expensive the property you live in. So I think there's a strong case for reforming council tax and making it both more up to date and potentially less regressive. Now, any change in council tax you made, if you wanted to get the full benefits of that, would also need to be accompanied by funding reform for local government. And that's because if you didn't also adjust council funding at the same time as updating and reforming council tax, well, each council would need to raise just as much council tax as now if it wanted to maintain spending. Individual properties would see their bills go up or down, but councils would have to change their band D rates to make sure that they raise just as much as now. So the average bill charged by each LA would be unchanged compared to now. So if we want to kind of see reform of council tax that would need to be kind of done in the context of broader reform to local government funding as well. Now, let's assume that was done. We did some research last year for the Welsh Government looking at what the impact of revaluing and reforming council tax in Wales could be on households in different parts of Wales and households with different characteristics. So these maps show the effect of reforming council tax on the average bills charged in different local authorities in Wales. And the first map here shows the impact of just doing a pure revaluation. So taking account the fact that prices have changed since the last revaluation. And you can see that there'd be modest changes in council tax bills across Wales. Greens show areas where bills would go up a bit, and oranges where bills would go down a bit. And the biggest changes would be an increase in the average bill in Anglesey of plus 5%, and a reduction in Flintshire and Wrexham of minus 6 or minus 7%. That reflects the fact that, for example, Wrexham and Flintshire have seen the slowest house price growth over the last sort of 18 years since the last revaluation. Making council tax continuous and proportional to value, so not only revaluing it, but also making it then proportional to value, removing the regressivity of council tax, that would have much bigger impacts on average bills. You can see the colours here darker, that means bigger changes. The biggest increases in bills would be in the most expensive parts of Wales, the Vale of Glamorgan and Monmouthshire. The biggest decreases would be in the valleys, where the prices are cheapest, with the biggest cut being in Merthyr Tydfil, an average fall in bill of around 20%, we estimate. Looking at winners and losers across households, looking first at revaluation, the big yellow bar here shows that most households would see very little change in their bill as a result of revaluation. That's because they wouldn't move up or down bands. But you would then see around 1 in 8 households see a fall in their bill of more than £200, and another 1 in 8 an increase of more than £200. A continuous and proportional system, so getting rid of the regressivity, would see much bigger changes. I think the kind of most notable thing here is that there would be rather more gainers. More than a third of households would gain more than £200 if their bill fall by more than £200, compared to 1 in 6 that would see it increase by more than £200. Although the losses amongst this group seeing an increase would be larger on average than the gains amongst those seeing, cuts in their bills. Now, this graph will show you the impact of making it a continuous and proportional system across the income distribution. And because poorer households tend to live in less valuable properties, a continuous and proportional system would see falls in the average bill for poorer households and an increase in the average bills for the richer households that tend to live in more valuable properties. This line here shows it as a percentage of income rather than in cash terms. You can see poorer households gaining on average about 0.5% of their income, richer households losing the equivalent of around 0.4% of their income. I should say the fact that the gains are not even bigger for the poorest households is the fact that council tax is often already paid for many of them by the council tax reduction scheme. Those that are not claiming the entitlement to which they're due, they actually would tend to gain rather a lot more than this amongst the poorest part of the population. Because younger people tend to live in less valuable properties as well, we'd also see a fall in the average bill for younger people and an increase in the average bill for older people who tend to live in more valuable properties. So when we actually did this report, our conclusion was that reform and revaluation of council tax was actually increasingly important, but that there are several things to consider in taking reform forward. First, transitional and mitigation measures to put in place, and that could include, for example, deferral schemes to help the sort of asset-rich, cash-poor manage a potentially large increase in their bills if they live in one of these very large properties, very valuable properties that's currently, if you like, undertaxed, but don't have high incomes. That could be deferred. Such schemes operate in many countries. There's issues about how to update the values, and also putting in place a system to make sure that regular evaluations take place so that we don't get ourselves in sort of a situation where values are 18 years out of date again. Although I should say that's not as bad as in England and Scotland, where they're now 30 years out of date. I think there's also an opportunity for even wider reform, not just looking at council tax, not just revaluing and reforming council tax, but actually linking that to the rest of the system. Reforming business rates, replacing business rates with a land value tax, for example, potentially removing the disincentive to invest in property and plant, and simplifying a whole load of reliefs that are there to try to, reduce the burden of rates on newly developed property, or to stop people demolishing properties. Could abolish land transactions tax with revenues made up from the current taxes like council tax and business rates. That would be an efficient and I think a fair reform to the tax system. It will remove the disincentives for people to transact, to move to take jobs, to trade up, trade down, find a more appropriate property for themselves. And I think overall, property tax, which is one of the areas of taxation which is already largely under the Welsh Government's control, there really is an opportunity for a fairer, more efficient, and if so, a party so wish, a more progressive tax system in this area. So that brings us to talking about what the parties propose for property tax. And by far the most detailed reform proposals have been set out by Plaid Cymru. In the short term, they propose a council tax revaluation with additional bans for higher value properties, with the aim of making council tax more proportional to value. And I think that would be a sensible reform. Clearly, revaluation, I think, is increasingly vital. Making it more proportional to value with extra bans as a stepping stone, as we'll see, would also, if you want to make it more progressive, be a sort of step in the right direction. They also say they would charge higher council tax for second homes. I think that's a more debatable proposal. It depends on the extent to which you think you want to be tilting the property market away from second homeowners. But if you have views on that, I think reforming council tax rather than reforming land transactions tax is a more sensible way to do that. So I think this trebling of the land transaction tax on second homes, I think, would be a less sensible change, an even less sensible change than increasing the council tax for second homes. If you want to, discourage second home ownership, why do you want to discourage second home ownership when the properties are transacting more, rather than when it's properties that are potentially being unused? That doesn't make so much sense to me. In the longer term, Plaid Cymru say they would replace business rates with a tax on commercial and industrial land paid by the owner, not the occupier. And that eventually they would move domestic property onto this tax as well. And I think this is quite an interesting proposal. I think, as I said, I think there's a case to actually move to a land tax that would remove some of the distortions we currently have against investment in the business rate system. I think moving to the owner, not the occupier, that sounds like a huge change, a big change in the tax burden. I'm not sure that is such a big change in the tax burden. As I said at the kind of start, there's pretty good evidence, or very good evidence actually, that the long run economic incidence of property taxes is already on the owner. But I think this sort of reform, making it legally on the owner as well, makes that clearer, and it potentially speeds this sort of adjustment up. It currently takes place via changes in rents and property values. In this sort of system, it would happen sort of immediately by design. I also think that the exemption that's suggested for agricultural land here potentially adds some complexities to the system, and potentially creates some boundary issues where land is potentially used for activities which could be considered both agricultural and industrial in nature, sort of issues around some of the sort of food processing areas. I actually think it would probably be simpler to actually impose the tax on agricultural land. And if you think that kind of affects the viability of farming, you can return the payments to the agricultural sector via, for example, payments of public goods or things like that. They also say that they would replace council tax with a system too, creating a single land and property tax. I think it's interesting. Will this actually cover the sort of value of the property as well as the land for residential? Another big question is will it continue to be at a lower rate than for business land or property? When you look at the kind of tax rates on residential property as a percentage of value, council tax percentage of value, compare that to business rates, council tax is a much lower percentage of the value of the property. Would that still be the case under this single land and property tax? Would you have different rates for different types of land, or would you equalize the rates, seeing tax bills on residential property go up and tax bills on business property go down? That would be a big question for this system. And I think there's also some interesting interactions with the UK government and the fiscal framework, because moving taxes from the occupier to the owner is likely to see a change in rents. As I said, at the moment, that already happens. Basically, rents fall to shift the tax onto the owner. If you then put the tax directly on the owner, rents will go back up. That means, for example, higher universal credit or housing benefit bills for the UK government. Will the UK government ask for compensation for this sort of change under the fiscal framework? The Conservatives are the other party that say, a fair bit about property taxes. Gitto has already talked about the council tax free, so I won't mention that again. They also talk about local referendums for increases in council tax of over 5%. That's a similar to a policy that's in place in England. On the one hand, you can say that would give local people a greater say, more control over local taxation. On the other hand, it would put property tax, council tax, as the only tax in Wales where there is a referendum requirement. And I know in England, it's kind of, council's argument against this is that, for UK taxes, for central government taxes, elections are the point at which voters have their say in the round of other issues. Why should council tax be different? Why aren't local elections, again, the place of accountability where council tax can be considered in the round rather than sort of as a single issue sort of thing? They also have policies for business rates, which again, Gitto mentioned, so I won't talk about those. They do talk about setting up a task and finish group to consider broader reforms in the longer term. Land and transactions tax, they talk about abolishing for first-time buyers and raising the threshold. I mentioned earlier that land and transactions tax is it's a bad tax. It would be good to reduce it. So this would be a step in the right direction of reducing this inefficient tax. However, it would need to be seen in the context of a tight budget. The other parties say rather a lot less about property tax in their manifestos. I must say I was a little bit disappointed actually that Welsh Labour could only muster up an offering of a fairer system for all, when in fact it was the Welsh Labour government that commissioned a whole gamut of research looking at property taxes before the election to potentially inform future directions for tax policy. I would have hoped to have seen something a bit more concrete come out of that review. They also, I think the other kind of standout suggestion from Welsh Labour is the idea of potentially offering local discretion on land transactions tax to local authorities, which would be quite a big change and quite a sort of a devolution of additional tax power to local authorities. Welsh Lib Dems, on the other hand, actually go against their usual, localising tendencies with a plan to centralise, to make local authorities use their full council tax premium powers for second homes. I mean, I think it's a legitimate policy to have if you strongly want to discourage second home ownership, but it does go against the usual grain of Lib Dem thinking. They also say they would investigate replacing council tax, but say little more than that. The other party I briefly looked at was the Abolish the Welsh Assembly Party. What they say is, in line with the rest of the manifesto, is that property taxes should be determined by the UK government, as there would be no Welsh government. Now, I think an interesting thing with this is that, of course, if there was no reform evaluation at the UK-wide level, there'd be no reform evaluation at a Welsh level for council tax. But if there were reform and evaluation at a UK-wide level, potentially Welsh households could gain quite significantly from that approach compared to a reform evaluation in Wales alone. And the reason is because property prices in Wales are rather a lot lower than in England, and they've gone up rather a lot less than over the last kind of decades since the last evaluation. So if there was reform here, I think Welsh households could gain. But of course, this is part of a much bigger manifesto commitment to sort of effectively abolish the Welsh government. So I'm not saying that this is the be all and end all of the abolish the Welsh Assembly Party's plans. This is one small part of their plans, but I thought an interesting one, how it links it to property tax. Okay, so I've run over my allotted time, so I will go very quickly through this last bit. I think it's very welcome that council tax evaluation and reform seems to be on the agenda, but only Plaid Cymru have set out detailed plans. I think it's really unfortunate that all the parties, with perhaps a partial exception of the Conservatives, seem to be attached to land transactions tax. And all I can kind of, the only reason I can kind of think of that is that it's a case of sort of plucking the goose with the least amount of hissing. People know this tax; they're already spending tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds at the point of making a transaction. Some tax on top they don't like, but there's less hissing than trying to tax people every year as under council tax. The Conservatives' plan at property tax reduction, Plaid and Libs potentially a net tax increase, given what they suggest on second homes. But if they do go into a proportional system like Plaid Cymru suggests, and potentially the Libs and Labour could go down, that would mean gains for most lower middle income households and lower average bills in the valleys in North East Wales, even if the total tax take was increased slightly. And that's it. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed to the panel for the really fascinating analyses shared in those three presentations. We do have a little bit of time for change. I'm going to take for questions. Sorry, I'm going to take the liberty of just extending the event by just 5 minutes so we can squeeze in some more questions. And I'll ask the panel obviously to keep responses as concise as possible so we can get through as many as we usefully can. So the first question I'm going to ask comes from Councillor Carol Clement Williams from Neathport Talbot County Borough Council. This is a question received in advance. So she writes, I have a £5 million gap in my funding, and we are using £3 million out of reserves to fund our services. We have been under enormous pressure from the opposition and the public to set a 0% council tax rise, even though ours is the second lowest rise at 2.75. What would the team say about doing that, please? And she also notes, due to the COVID pandemic, we have been unable to reduce our revenue demand, so I still have a gap to close next year. So who can I invite from the panel to respond to Councillor Clement Williams, please?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. I mean, I'm not sure if I can specifically comment about Neathport Talbot situation because most of our analysis is done on an all Wales basis, but certainly based on the reports that we put out 2 weeks ago, it looks quite optimistic to me to be saying that councils could meet spending pressures whilst at the same time maintaining below inflation council tax increases over the coming years. So to give an example, we sort of identified a £180 million funding gap next year, assuming a 4.5% increase. And of course, if you don't meet those spending pressures, then that does involve trade-offs, whether it's accepting lower levels of service provision, and that might not be particularly feasible for some maybe more statutory responsibilities. But I think it goes back to the point that David was making, and one thing I'd really like to see from the next Welsh Government is meaningful reform of council tax, because for many households this will be their largest bill, larger than the payroll taxes that they pay. And you know, at the same time, council tax is one of the least progressive, at least in terms of income, least progressive taxes that we currently have.
Thank you very much, Kian. And actually, Kian, I'm going to stay with you for the second question that we're going to take from Daniel Davis from the BBC. So he writes, Kian presented pre-pandemic versus baseline predicted growth in funding. Can I confirm, 1, these are UK government plans for revenue, 2, baseline is the more recent of the two?
Yeah, so the baseline is the most recent projection. They're not UK government spending plans per se, because the UK government doesn't have any multi-year spending commitments outside of health and schools. So they're just basically what's implied by what was set out at the budget back in March 2021. In terms of the pre-pandemic plan scenario, basically since March 2020 and later in autumn 2020, the UK government have made cuts to spending beyond 2022-23, whilst at the same time, of course, increasing spending this year and last year on the pandemic. And so, yeah, our scenario basically illustrated what would happen if you were to reverse the cuts that have been made since March 2020. And that would result in about a £600 million uplift to the Welsh Government's budget next year. So I hope that answers the questions.
Many thanks, Kian. Right, to the next question. And as I say, we will get to as many as we can. Many thanks for all the questions that have come in. This question is, what would be the impact on Barnett consequentials should the UK government utilise the powers of the Internal Market Act to spend on previously devolved areas? Who in the panel would like to address that question?
Yeah, I think it's quite difficult to say, obviously, the extent to which, you know, some of the spending commitments, such as on the levelling up fund in England, that was firstly expected to yield consequentials for the Welsh Government. It turns out that it won't be, and that it would be part of the UK-wide fund. And I guess, you know, if you see that as a sort of replacement, if you look at a replacement to EU funding levels, then the Welsh local authorities bidding for these projects will need to get quite a big chunk of funding to meet what we used to get through European funding. Whether we get sort of a population share remains to be determined. So there's a lot of uncertainties. I think one interesting thing about the Internal Market Bill in particular is potentially some of the restrictions that it puts on policies, you know, of all the parties. Sort of higher education, for example, sort of the ability to change fees, etc., may be constrained by the UK Internal Market Bill, which is an interesting dynamic, for the next 5 years.
If I could say something very quick, because I know we haven't got much time. I think, kind of adding on to what Guido says, I think working out what it means for not just say Welsh Government, but like overall funding for Wales really depends on what sort of funding it's replacing. So if, for example, and sort of on what formulas or what methods are being used to allocate it. So for example, you know, as Guido was saying, you know, if this was to replace, you know, EU funding, well, Wales had a very high share of the EU funding. You would need to see, you know, a very high share of this, you know, funding via the the Internal Market Act type funding to make up for that. On the other hand, if it was, you know, funding that was previously done by the Barnett formula, well, the Barnett formula gives, you know, Wales, well, effectively a population share. If there was a sort of needs-based formula for kind of funding on certain areas like, you know, economic development or things like that, in all likelihood, Wales would tend to do relatively well from a needs-based funding than it would from a Barnett-based funding. So whether Wales wins or loses, you know, in terms of funding from this type of approach would depend on what funding is being replaced and what methods are being used to allocate any funding, you know, from using this approach.
Thank you very much, Guido and David, and thank you for the question. So our next question comes from David Powell, who asks, Guido referenced productivity in the social care sector. Could he expand on the comment, please?
Yeah, so I was basing that on sort of the ONS estimates of productivity in the social care sector at the UK level. There's been some productivity growth over the last 20 years, but it's been pretty small. And in terms of when we project forward funding pressures on local governments, I think most studies assume no growth in productivity in the social care. So that was what I was getting at, is that it's quite hard to find efficiency gains of 1% a year in what is quite a large area of spending.
Yeah, I mean, if I can add to that, I mean, I think health in general, productivity for health spending tends to lag behind the economy as a whole. And when you think about it, most of those efficiency gains you can make come from better diagnosis and treatment. But because social care is largely about the delivery of that care, there's been very little change in how social care is delivered over the past maybe 20 years, going back even further perhaps. And so, yeah, that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen much productivity gains over the past decade and more.
Thank you very much. Now to another question. This is particularly directed at David, please. David, do you view a reform of council tax as proposed by Plaid as feasible within one term, or should policy focus on shorter term options such as re-evaluation?
So I think that if you look at Plaid Cymru's manifesto, they do kind of suggest, I guess, a two-stage process. So the first stage would be a revaluation and adding a few additional bands. And then the next stage would be to sort of move to this single, proportional property tax. Although I said there's a kind of question about whether there's different rates for residential and commercial as now effectively, or do they equalize those? I think, it would be possible to kind of move towards, certainly on the residential side, I think, actually an unbanded, do reevaluation and an unbanded system over the next, 5 years. Also going to, a sort of a land value tax and integrating it with business rates and changing it to being on the owner rather than the occupier. I think that would be a longer term issue. Less so, because of the sort of radicalness of the changes in the actual tax burden, but more so because of the sort of information and sort of changes in valuation, administration, and data that you would need. At the moment, for example, we just don't have good data on who owns all of the land and all the property in Wales. So you would need to kind of fix that before doing the kind of full stage. But I think certainly revaluing, adding bands, and even revaluing and making it proportional to value, I think would be feasible over a parliamentary term.
Thank you very much, David. And now let me come to the final question of the event. So this comes from Haris Hussain. So do you think that childcare spending is going to be sufficient because COVID-19 has caused services that carers depend on to shut? There is going to be a backlog of childcare related issues in deprived areas. Who in the panel would like to respond to this question? Yeah,
in specific, I do have more slides on some of the childcare proposals of the different parties, which will be available online. Specifically in terms of what they're planning on doing, I think the Welsh Labour Manifesto proposes some increase in the expansion of eligibility for the childcare offer for those in education and training, but doesn't really say on how much that would entail or what the cost of that would be. And in terms of Plaid Cymru and the Conservatives, they're quite similar expansion of childcare to 2-year-olds from the 3 to 4-year-olds currently. So we think that could cost something in the order of £40 million based on existing costs, but obviously we don't really have a sense of the potential COVID-19 impact on underlying childcare spending, and also sort of what the overall sort of funding pressures for that sector might be over the next few years.
Excellent. Many thanks indeed. So certainly it's time for me to draw proceedings to a close. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but many thanks to the panelists for being so concise in your responses. So I would like to extend our thanks to our expert panel today. So Gito Ifan, Kian Sean and David Phillips for sharing their analyses this morning in their presentations and the questions. And of course, to all of you who joined us this morning and who provided us with some questions as well. As we noted, the event has been recorded and will go onto the university's YouTube channel in due course. So please keep an eye out on the Wales Government Centre's Twitter feed, where we'll let you know when the recording is available. And of course, you can find out more information about the work of the Wales Fiscal Analysis on the Wales Government Centre website and also on Twitter. But with that, it just remains for me to thank you once again for joining us and to wish you a pleasant rest of day. Thank you.